Dzerzhinsk was a Soviet industrial city whose development, economy, and daily life were closely connected to large chemical plants located on its outskirts. From the moment the city began to grow, industry played a central role in shaping its structure and purpose. Factories provided employment for thousands of residents and influenced everything from housing construction to transport routes and work schedules. From the outside, Dzerzhinsk looked much like many other cities of its time. Rows of apartment buildings stood next to schools, shops, clinics, and public offices. Public transport connected residential districts with industrial zones, following routes designed around shift changes and factory timetables. The rhythm of the city was steady and predictable, shaped by work routines that repeated day after day. Chemical production was a normal part of the city's identity and simply reflected how the city functioned. Industrial facilities were not hidden or distant. They were an expected element of the surrounding landscape. Most residents grew accustomed to living near them and rarely gave this proximity much thought. As in many industrial areas, certain smells occasionally appeared in the air. They were usually brief and familiar enough that they did not attract special attention. People adjusted in simple ways, closing windows, waiting for the air to clear, and continuing with their day. Over time, these small adjustments became part of everyday life. Chlorine was one of many substances used in local chemical production. It was widely applied in industry and infrastructure, including water treatment and manufacturing processes. Storage tanks, pipelines, and transport systems handled chlorine regularly as part of routine operations. For factory workers, it was a known material that required standard precautions. For most residents, it remained something abstract, a name associated with industry rather than a direct concern. There was a general expectation that industrial processes were monitored and managed according to established procedures. The systems in place had been operating for years, and their reliability was largely taken for granted. Accidents were not expected to affect daily life, and few people felt the need to think about potential risks in detail. On the day of the chlorine leak, the city began as it always had. People left their homes for work, children went to school, and buses followed their usual routes. Shops opened on time, and offices filled with workers. Nothing in the atmosphere of the city suggested that this day would differ from countless others before it. Within the industrial zone, a technical malfunction occurred, the kind of failure that, on its own, did not immediately stand out. At first, it caused no visible disruption beyond the boundaries of the facility. The city continued to move at its familiar pace, unaware that the conditions in the air around it were quietly beginning to change. The technical failure occurred within the industrial zone on the outskirts of Dzerzhinsk, in an area where chemical processes were carried out daily. At the moment it happened, there was nothing to indicate that the situation would extend beyond the facility itself. Equipment failures, adjustments, and minor disruptions were part of normal industrial work and were usually resolved without wider consequences. The release of chlorine did not begin with noise or visible damage. There was no explosion and no sudden interruption of operations. Instead, the gas started to escape gradually, entering the surrounding air in small but increasing amounts. At first, the change was subtle. Workers closest to the source noticed a sharp, unfamiliar smell that stood out from the usual industrial background. Some experienced irritation in the eyes or throat, sensations that were uncomfortable but not immediately alarming. Similar symptoms had occurred before during routine work, and the initial reaction was cautious rather than urgent. As the chlorine continued to spread, the gas moved beyond the boundaries of the industrial site. Carried by light air currents, it reached nearby areas where people were not expecting any disturbance. In residential districts close to the factories, residents began to notice a distinct odor, stronger and more persistent than the smells they were accustomed to. People reacted in practical ways. Windows were closed. Some stepped outside briefly to check where the smell was coming from. Others assumed it would pass, as it usually did. Chlorine behaves differently from many other industrial gases. It is heavier than air and tends to remain closer to the ground, especially in calm weather. This allowed it to accumulate in low-lying areas and along streets, where it lingered longer than expected. The gas was invisible, making it difficult to judge its concentration or direction of movement. Gradually, physical discomfort became more noticeable. Coughing became more frequent. Eyes began to water. Breathing felt tight for some people, particularly those who spent more time outdoors. Despite these signs, there was still uncertainty about what was happening. The source of the smell was not immediately clear, and information traveled slowly. Without official guidance, residents relied on personal judgment and past experience, trying to decide whether the situation required action or patience. Inside medical facilities, doctors began to see patients with similar complaints. Irritated airways, breathing difficulties, and eye inflammation pointed to chemical exposure. These cases provided the first clear indication that the situation extended beyond a localized industrial issue. As awareness grew, it became evident that the chlorine release was not a short-lived event. The gas had already affected a wider area, and its presence in the air was no longer limited to the industrial zone. What had begun as a technical malfunction was now a situation involving the city itself. The routine of the day had not yet fully broken, but it was starting to bend. The air, once taken for granted, was becoming something people paid close attention to. Not because of panic, but because it no longer felt the same. As reports of discomfort and unusual odors increased, the situation in Dzerzhinsk gradually shifted from an internal industrial matter to a broader coordination task. Information reached plant supervisors, medical services, and local authorities through standard channels based on observations rather than confirmed data. At the industrial site, technical personnel worked to identify the source of the leak and limit further release. Procedures focused on stabilizing equipment, isolating affected sections, and reducing the amount of chlorine entering the air. These actions required time, as systems had to be adjusted carefully to avoid additional complications. Medical services responded as symptoms became more consistent across different parts of the city. Clinics and hospitals began receiving patients with similar complaints, mainly involving breathing discomfort, eye irritation, and coughing. Medical staff treated these cases according to established protocols for chemical exposure, while also collecting information that could help clarify the scale of the incident. Emergency services were notified and placed on standby. Ambulance teams transported affected individuals, particularly those with stronger reactions or pre-existing respiratory conditions. In many cases, treatment focused on relieving symptoms rather than addressing severe injury, as most exposures were limited in duration. At the same time, local administrators assessed the situation using available reports. Decisions were made based on observations from the industrial zone, medical facilities, and environmental monitoring points. The absence of clear visual indicators made assessment difficult, as chlorine could not be seen and its concentration varied depending on location and air movement. Public guidance was limited and practical. Residents were advised to reduce outdoor activity, close windows, and pay attention to how they felt physically. These recommendations reflected a cautious approach, aimed at minimizing exposure without causing unnecessary disruption to daily life. Transport and public services continued to operate, though with increased attention to changing conditions. In some areas closer to the industrial zone, movement became quieter as people chose to remain indoors. Schools and workplaces adjusted informally, depending on local conditions and individual judgment. Within the industrial sector, coordination continued between technical specialists and supervisory staff. The priority remained containing the leak and preventing further spread. Monitoring teams tracked changes in air quality, noting gradual improvements as control measures took effect. As the day progressed, it became clearer that the situation was stabilizing. The intensity of the smell decreased in most areas, and new medical cases appeared less frequently. While the incident was not yet fully resolved, the immediate phase of uncontrolled release was coming to an end. The city did not stop, but it slowed slightly, adapting to conditions as information became clearer. The response was measured and procedural, reflecting an effort to manage the situation through existing systems rather than emergency measures. As the chlorine concentration in the air gradually decreased, everyday life in Dzerzhinsk began to return to its usual rhythm. The sharp smell that had drawn attention earlier became weaker and appeared less frequently, especially outside areas closest to the industrial zone. For many residents, this change was the first clear sign that the situation was moving toward resolution. Medical facilities continued to observe patients who had been exposed during the earlier hours of the release. Most cases involved temporary irritation of the respiratory system, eyes, and throat. Treatment focused on monitoring, rest, and symptom relief. For many people, recovery was quick, though some required additional observation over the following days. Outside hospitals, people compared experiences in a practical, restrained way. Neighbors discussed where the smell had been strongest and how long it had lasted. These conversations were calm and factual, reflecting a shared effort to understand what had happened rather than dwell on it. Workplaces and schools resumed normal schedules as conditions improved. In some areas, adjustments remained in place for a short time, such as keeping windows closed or limiting outdoor activities. These measures were seen as temporary and gradually phased out as the air cleared. For residents who had lived in the city for many years, the incident fit into a familiar pattern. Industrial life sometimes brought inconveniences, and this event, while noticeable, did not fundamentally alter daily routines. The expectation was that systems would be reviewed, technical issues addressed, and work would continue. Environmental monitoring showed steady improvement. Measurements taken after the leak indicated that chlorine levels had returned to acceptable limits. This data reinforced the sense that the immediate impact had passed and that no ongoing exposure remained. Still, the incident left behind a subtle awareness. People paid closer attention to the air for a time, noticing smells more readily and reacting more quickly to discomfort. This awareness was not driven by fear, but by experience. A quiet reminder of how closely the city's life was connected to its industrial surroundings. Within industrial facilities, internal reviews took place. Equipment was inspected, procedures were evaluated, and technical explanations were documented. These steps were part of standard practice following any operational disruption, intended to prevent similar situations in the future. As days passed, public attention shifted back to routine matters. Conversations moved on, schedules normalized, and the city resumed its familiar pace. The chlorine leak became a remembered event rather than an ongoing concern. What remained was not a sense of alarm, but a practical understanding shared by many residents. Industrial systems, even well-established ones, could change conditions quickly. Living in such a city meant adapting when needed and returning to normal when possible. After the immediate effects of the chlorine release had passed, attention gradually shifted toward summarizing what had occurred and restoring normal operations. In Dzerzhinsk, This process followed established administrative and industrial procedures rather than emergency protocols. Technical specialists completed inspections of the equipment involved in the incident. The malfunction was analyzed in detail, with attention given to material wear, operational conditions, and maintenance history. Reports focused on identifying the specific cause of the failure and outlining steps to prevent similar issues in the future. These findings were shared within professional and administrative structures responsible for industrial safety. From an official standpoint, the incident was classified as a controlled industrial accident. The release had been limited in duration, and measurements taken afterward confirmed that chlorine concentrations had returned to acceptable levels. Based on available data, no ongoing environmental contamination was detected. Medical assessments supported this conclusion. Follow-up observations showed that most affected individuals experienced short-term symptoms that resolved without lasting complications. Patients with pre-existing respiratory conditions were advised to remain under observation, but no widespread long-term health effects were identified at the population level. Public communication remained concise and factual. Statements focused on the technical resolution of the issue and the restoration of normal conditions. The absence of continued exposure was emphasized, reinforcing the sense that the situation had been fully addressed. Within the city, the incident gradually took on a defined place in local memory. It was referenced as a specific event with a clear beginning and end, rather than as part of an ongoing problem. For many residents, it became one of several moments that illustrated the realities of living in an industrial environment. Over time, attention shifted back to routine concerns. Work schedules, seasonal activities, and everyday planning once again shaped conversations. The chlorine release was no longer a topic of regular discussion, though it occasionally resurfaced in practical contexts, such as workplace safety briefings or personal recollections. At the institutional level, the incident contributed to incremental adjustments. Maintenance schedules were refined, monitoring practices reviewed, and documentation updated. These changes were gradual and technical, reflecting an approach focused on system reliability rather than public messaging. Looking back, the event did not redefine the city, nor did it fundamentally change how industry and daily life interacted. Instead, it reinforced existing patterns. Industrial systems required attention, residents adapted when necessary, and normal life resumed once conditions stabilized. The chlorine leak became part of the city's documented history, not as a turning point, but as an example of how industrial incidents were identified, managed, and absorbed into the ongoing rhythm of an industrial society. With time, the chlorine release became one of many documented industrial incidents in the history of Dzerzhinsk. It was not remembered as an extraordinary event, nor as something that fundamentally changed the city's direction. Instead, it settled into the background of local history, defined by dates, reports, and personal recollections. For residents, memory of the incident varied. Some remembered the smell in the air and the discomfort that followed. Others recalled little more than a brief disruption to an otherwise ordinary day. As years passed, these individual memories softened, blending into the broader experience of life in an industrial city. Dzerzhinsk continued to function much as it had before. Factories operated, transport routes remained active, and daily routines followed familiar patterns. Industrial work remained central to the city's economy and identity, and the presence of chemical production was still regarded as a practical reality rather than an abstract concern. The chlorine incident did not stand alone. It existed alongside other minor disruptions, maintenance events, and technical adjustments that naturally occurred over decades of industrial operation. Together, these moments formed a quiet record of how complex systems behaved over time. What made this event notable was not its scale, but its clarity. It demonstrated how quickly conditions could change without visible warning, and how closely daily life was linked to processes happening beyond public view. At the same time, it showed how quickly stability could return once those processes were brought back under control. In later years, Dzerzhinsk would be mentioned in broader discussions about industrial development and environmental conditions. These conversations often looked at long timelines rather than individual incidents, focusing on cumulative effects rather than single events. The chlorine leak became one small reference point within a much larger context. For the people who lived through it, the incident remained grounded in practical experience. It was remembered not through headlines or dramatic imagery, but through simple details: closed windows, coughing, conversations with neighbors, and the gradual return of ordinary air. History does not always move through dramatic turning points. Often, it advances through moments that are managed, resolved, and then absorbed into everyday life. The chlorine release in Dzerzhinsk followed this quieter path. It ended without spectacle. Life continued without interruption, and the city carried on, shaped by industry, routine, and the steady passage of time.